Good evening. I'm Robin Garrell, the president of the Graduate Center, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to another lively and thoughtful conversation, a new topic in our series of public programs devoted to change. Graduate Center public programs connect us to issues and ideas that are vital to us. Over the past 6 months, the unprecedented disruptions from COVID-19 have underscored the formidable economic and racial inequalities in our society and have amplified calls for change. Tonight, the Change series turns its focus to education, with leading scholars and activists whose work explores how we can make education more equitable and create a more just and democratic society. The co-sponsors for this discussion, our doctoral program in urban education and the Futures Initiative, have both been at the forefront of rethinking and remaking education policy and practice grounded in educational equity. Urban education, through rigorous research and interdisciplinary instruction, is training the next generation of educational leaders in policy, curricula, and political action. The Futures Initiative, with its focus on greater equity in all levels of higher education, is redesigning pedagogies that are student-centered and bringing innovative approaches to graduate education for teachers. How do we make education more equitable? We start by recognizing that it is not, by being open to learning how progress can be made, and then by committing ourselves to action. This evening, we have the opportunity to engage with scholars and innovators who are defining the change and leading the conversation. With us tonight is the founding director of the Futures Initiative and one of the most prominent scholars and changemakers in education. Cathy Davidson is distinguished professor in our doctoral program in English and in the master's programs in digital humanities and data analysis and visualization. She's the co-founder and co-director of HAYSTACK, which stands for Humanities, Arts, Science and Technology Alliance and Collaboratory, the world's first academic social network, now with over 17,500 members. The most recent of her many publications is the award-winning book, The New Education: How to Revolutionize Higher Education to Prepare Students for a World in Flux. I'm honored to welcome my colleague, Cathy Davidson, and our other extraordinary panelists whom Cathy will introduce. Cathy, the screen and mic are yours. Welcome.
Thank you, President Garrell. And thank you all for joining us tonight. Tonight, I have the incredible pleasure to introduce you to two of my sheroes, Professor Tressie McMillan Cottom and Professor Carla Shedd. These are two of the most learned, eloquent, and passionate experts on education and inequality and the relationship between those two. What it is, what's wrong with it, how we can fix education to be more equitable and support a more vibrant and equitable democracy. They are also lively, direct, challenging speakers, so I know the next 45 minutes are going to fly by. We will have time left at the end of our conversation for your questions. So as questions arise, make sure to put them in the Zoom chat, in the question, not in the chat, but in the question box. My thanks to Ms. Karen Sanders, Director of Public Programs, for helping sort those out at the end. I'm going to keep my introductions brief so we can move on to the important topic of making education more equitable. Dr. Tressie McMillan Cottom is an award-winning author, researcher, educator, and cultural critic whose work has been recognized nationally and internationally for the urgency and depth of her incisive critical analysis of technology, higher education, class, race, and gender. She's a professor in the School of Information and Library Science at the University of North Carolina and senior research fellow at the Center for Information Technology and Public Life. She's the author of Lower Ed, The Troubling Rise of For-Profit Colleges in the New Economy, and is also the author of a brilliant collection, Thick and Other Essays, which was a finalist for the 2019 National Book Award. Professor Cottom also co-hosts my favorite podcast, Here to Slay, with Roxane Gay, an international perspective on celebrity, culture, politics, art, life, love, and a lot more. Dr. Carla Shedd is Associate Professor of Sociology and Urban Education at the Graduate Center, CUNY. Her research and teaching focus on education, criminalization and criminal justice, race and ethnicity, law, social inequity, and urban policy. Professor Shedd's first book, Unequal City, Race, Schools, and Perceptions of Injustice, has won multiple academic awards, including the prestigious C. Wright Mills Award, given to the top social science book in the field of social inequality. Unequal City examines Chicago public schools. It probes the intersections of race, place, education, and the expansion of the American carceral state. Professor Shedd is currently working on a new book, When Protection and Punishment Collide, America's Juvenile Court System and the Carceral Continuum. She has been featured on numerous television shows and radio shows, MSNBC, C-SPAN's Washington Journal, PBS NewsHour, and WNYC's Brian Lehrer's show. I promise it's going to be an exciting evening. I'm not sure we're going to solve the problems of inequity in education, but I know we're going to address them. Welcome, Professor Shedd and Cottom. It's such an honor and so great to have you here tonight.
Thank you, Cathy, and thank you to the Graduate Center for having me, and especially for putting me in conversation with Carla. Believe it or not, we have not done this yet, and that was a problem.
Wow, I'm problem solved.
Thank you for doing that.
That's great. Let me start with the question that's on everybody's mind right now, COVID and education. Some systems like CUNY are entirely online. Others, including the University of North Carolina, began face-to-face and then went online. Others, like Wesleyan University, I know, are not only doing what seems to be a good job of staying face-to-face, but are actually involving students and faculty in studying what they're doing, hopefully coming up with models for all of our society to figure out a way to come together again equitably. Clearly, inequality, race, money, all of those things fit together in these solutions. But let me ask you, how are we doing? How can we do better? What are we doing right? What are we doing wrong? And what are you thinking about? Maybe we'll start with Carla. I also want to talk about K through 12, because I know that's on your area of expertise and also very much on the minds of many of our viewers tonight.
Thank you for opening up with that important question. Especially in New York City, there's been such a varied response, and it does mark that we are living in an unequal nation, in an unequal city, and the ways that we have resources differently allocated to respond to COVID-19. So if I may even think about the beginning of the pandemic and sitting in my classroom on March 9th at the Graduate Center for Ed Policy, talking about these things and hearing the murmurs of, you know, something is happening where we may have to shut down, and knowing that the response of the Ivy League might be different from CUNY in that moment, and having these insights at the very beginning about how stratified the response could be was eye-opening. And then to move just to the end of that week in March, around March 12th, when things really shut down, to understand, okay, who was disposable, who was vulnerable, and to track those different patterns has been so instructive. And I will say, you know, COVID made it clear what schools do, what the function of education is. And if we think about it as a food distribution service, or if we think about it as keeping children out of the home and somewhere else besides the street, it gives you a great perspective about what the missions are and what we're actually doing in the name of education. And so I hope that we can think more on this in terms of laying clear what it is that school is supposed to do. And now with the re-entry to school, you know, often as someone who studies crime, we think about re-entry in a different way, but knowing that there's been a stratified re-entry process where New York City public school students will finally resume in-person schooling, perhaps tomorrow. We don't know, because it's changing hour by hour. But private schools have been easing back in for the last month or so. So the variation in the response and the stratification that is clear across so many different axes of difference, whether it's place, but also income and resources, and even type of school, matters so very much.
Tressie, what about for higher ed?
You know, interestingly enough, I think the challenges in higher ed are linked to the challenges in K through 12, because one of the things that, as Professor Shedd points out, that we learned if we did not know it before, or relearned had we forgotten, is that nothing moves in society unless we have provisions for children. So one of the very first things that happens in higher education is that we were confronted with two things that we don't like to be confronted with, I think, in social policy conversations. And it's one of my pet peeves in public discourse about higher education. And that is, we cannot let go of the idea of a college student being 19 years old, unencumbered, somewhat disembodied, quite frankly, right? They're just these able-bodied ideas that float around open air campus, when in fact we know empirically that the likely and typical college student is a woman, first of all, so I tend to refer to her as she. She is a woman, and she is a caregiver. She is a mother. Our college students then have been squeezed from both sides, the COVID crisis in K through 12 and the COVID crisis in higher education, as have been our staffers, our professional class, professors, et cetera. So we are relearning the lesson that I think it is very conveniently forgotten about when we make social policy. We like thinking of college students that way because that student doesn't need as much public provisioning as the student who needs childcare, who needs health care, who needs mental health services, who needs transportation, housing, food, etc. So we like the idea of a college student that doesn't need all of that. But what COVID has revealed is that that is not our typical student and has not been for quite some time. And similar to what's happened in K through 12 is one of the things that we realize is how much institutions have pulled apart by institutional type and resources. I mean, if you are at, I will say the Ivy League, I think goes without saying, but there's another sort of subset of extremely well-endowed, mostly private institutions that are having a vastly different experience of COVID right now. I just came back from visiting, checking on, I shouldn't say visiting because it sounds like I was cavorting, I promise you. I was checking on family in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I drove through Davidson, which is home to Davidson College, small liberal arts school, where the students are having, first of all, the time of their lives by every indicator. I mean, I talked to some, I have some friends who have children there. They are physically on campus, but attending class online, but they have all of their social resources. They're being tested every 2 or 3 days. They feel safe and secure. They have not seen a COVID outbreak there. You juxtapose that with Appalachia State, which is in the western part of the state of North Carolina, vastly different student demographics and community demographics, public university in a system that is beset by the political divisions that I think shape a lot of states right now. The state of North Carolina is a battleground, and we often fight that through higher education policy. So in Appalachian State, where a student just died of COVID yesterday, and where there hasn't yet been sort of an emergency response to that sort of crisis, and really grappling with being an open campus in the middle of a community that needs the university, but also needs public health provisions. So we just are seeing, and that doesn't even start to account for the institutions that I don't think we've talked nearly enough about, historically Black colleges and universities who are already in fragile geographic regions. They are in Black communities, which are disproportionately beset with the negative impacts of COVID, whether that be economically speaking or a likelihood of illness or death. So they're in these extremely vulnerable communities, and they themselves are under-resourced institutions, often with very limited political capital and cultural capital, and don't even exist sort of in our political imagination for the most part. We don't even know what the full rendering of what that experience looks like. So we're still grappling with what it looks like across different institutional types. But one thing is very clear. We have the mirror effect of what is happening in K through 12, which is that years of political decisions about how we will fund and provision higher education, particularly public higher education, has left communities and institutions with really an unfathomable sort of institutional choice. You can close, right? You can do the right thing for health and welfare and go bankrupt and lose your political capital because the state wants you open. You open. That's the case in North Carolina, many other states. And then you have a vastly different system that is able to provide for its students and mostly provide for its community as they define it. And so one of our major challenges there is reckoning with the way that we fund higher education. As is the case with most things, it very much so comes down to money. And then of course, embedded in who deserves money are questions about race and gender and class and ability.
Right. Yes, recently one of my colleagues at a very famous private university in our city of New York was bragging about how well behaved the students were and how well they were doing, and how they could keep the campus open because people were behaving well. And I said, well, CUNY students are essential workers. Many of our students are working full time, and they're working while in the most dangerous jobs in the city, which is basically helping middle class and upper middle class people not go outside. So you even have this interesting geography, cultural geography happening simultaneously, even within same physical area. Absolutely. Let's switch a little from COVID, if we can. It's hard to, but to the larger question of inequality and race and education, and maybe even try to think of what would be some good solutions. So I'm thinking about a study done at Georgia State University recently, where they found that a student was 7 times more likely to drop out of college for economic reasons than for educational reasons. Mm-hmm. They also found that the determining factor was less than $200. If you didn't have $200, if you were a typical Georgia State student, you dropped out of college because you didn't know anybody you could go to for $200, and there weren't systems set up for that. That's just mind-boggling to somebody who's paying $60,000 a year to send their child to school, but it's very much the reality that you were both pointing to, and again, higher education and mimicked also and mirrored also in K through 12. Let's talk a little bit about race, economic inequality, and education, how we got to this place, and if you had a magic wand to change it, what would you do to change it? And let's start with you, Tressie, first, and then Carla.
Okay, well, yeah, my magic wand usually looks more like a stick. I'm a stick kind of girl, because the magic wand is wish fulfillment. And here's the thing about wish fulfillment: people wish for themselves. Nobody ever gets 3 wishes from the genie and blows one on other people. Right, and that is precisely actually our problem, that our sort of faith-based institutions have for a very long time run on the fumes of individual wish fulfillment. And so everybody is so busy doing their wishing for themselves, their own personal economic mobility, et cetera, that nobody has been attending the fires of the collective part of the institution. So for that, I tend to think you actually, frankly, need a stick. And so if I could do that, there are 2 things. Education, as a sociologist of education, most sociologists of education will tell you that really we know most of the answers to these things. It's not quite the same as some other disciplines where there really is this great unknown. When it comes to, we know exactly what to do. It starts with strong federal protections for the students who need them. So historically, minoritized students and their families need protections at every point in the pipeline from K through 20. Period. We need differential, and this is the part where everybody gets stuck, differential funding for those people. You basically, if you want to disengage a student's outcomes or life chances from their family of origin, you have to fund different kinds of institutions and different kinds of students differently. That's just it. And these are the 2 things we've actually never been able to get over because they do work. Right? Our problem in education isn't that we don't know what works for the most part, is that what works, works. This has been this was our problem with Brown versus Board of Education. This is our problem with busing. This is our problem with, it works is the problem. Not that it does not work. That people do not want the leveling effect of educational access and attainment. But we are in a part of the cycle where we can see how that ends. There is no, endless individual achievement through education without a sort of collective base of benefit, right? You just cannot do that indefinitely. And I think that's where we are. We're sort of at the ends of thinking that you can use higher education as an individual savings account, as an individual mobility account, right? It really only works if it works for everybody. And so we have to sort of fund it that way, fund it differentially, and sort of get over the hump of this, idea that, a family in the top 3% income or wealth position should have the same access to student loan provisions as a poor family. I mean, really, are you kidding me? Or that you would fund tribal colleges and historically Black colleges and Hispanic serving institutions and community colleges the same way you would fund the state flagship, which has a selectivity score off the charts. I mean, we just kind of have to get over that policy-wise. Because within that's where the inequality sort of breeds. This is the case you see in Georgia State. Georgia State is a really great example because Georgia State became, if not a fully open access college, it is the more accessible college system there in Atlanta and the surrounding area. And so it serves a very racially diverse and economically diverse student population. And so the fragility of Georgia State is the fragility of every institution that's trying to do what we've proposed all colleges do, which serves a lot of students and a lot of families who have a lot of need with a limited amount of resources. And then it becomes survival of the fittest. And that can work for a little while when everything else is going well. The economy is expanding, there are economic opportunities, there's general good health at the community level. But when a pandemic shows up, all of that veneer of all of those other sort of coordinating safety nets fall apart, and you can see the institutional frailty for what it is. So Georgia State is actually a really good example of how racial inequality is perpetuated through the idea of higher education access. We expanded access, but access is never supposed to be the point. Returns are supposed to be the point. Economic mobility, health, welfare, those are supposed to be the goal. Yeah.
Thank you. Professor Shedd, what about you? How would you add to that, especially from a K-12 perspective?
It's amazing to be in conversation with a sociologist who, talks about that tension between individual sort of resources and then outcomes that are related very much to groups. And my wish fulfillment is very much based in institutions where we see the power and promise of school as something to disrupt patterns that, Dr. Cottom mentions as being increasing inequality, but we also have to know that they are replicating advantage and adding to advantage if we think about the various trajectories that people take through an educational continuum. I spend much of my time talking about a carceral continuum. So even that visual imagery of Brown v. Board and thinking about the Little Rock Nine ascending the steps of Central High and having federal protection in that moment. And who were they being protected from? They were being protected from, white people who did not want them in that space. They were being, the signal to these possibilities of changing someone's context of their neighborhood school to another school, and that would change their lives by virtue of sitting next to, white children who were all removed from the school. So this idea of schools being able to correct so many other failings in a society still rings true today. And I think it really hinges on the kind of promise that's possible, but also the setup for schools to have to bear that burden without thinking of the overlapping institutions as we've discussed, employment, and thinking about what the outcomes are and the income gaps and the wealth gaps that are then exacerbated through so many of these patterns. And so, as one who believes in institutions, because I want to see more funding go to the schools and not be attached to individual people who have to move across boundaries of race and place and class in order to have access to those resources. But instead to fully understand that you can't equally fund schools that have different needs. And so just what you were saying about the variation in funding across different higher ed institutions, we need that for pre-K through 12. And I think the buildup is there in talking about, you know, hey, the 3K, we funded that in public schooling in New York, and we're starting with the universal pre-K. So there's an idea that we can begin to put resources toward the start of young people's educational trajectories. And I'm hoping that will stem the flows of young people who end up in the juvenile court that I'm studying, you know. So it's true, we can do something to stem the flows from one institution that is formative and pro-social to others that are purportedly reformative but punitive and put people on very different life tracks.
Great, thank you. At the Futures Initiative, we have a saying we often use where we say that you can't change structural inequality with goodwill. You need new structures with equality at the core. And one of my favorite examples of that is higher ed, where we've had 40 years of critical race and critical gender studies. Lots of talk, lots of theory, and the academy is still largely white, largely male, and is more so the higher you move up the ladder, whether it's the tenure track, administrators, on and on. And I'm wondering, just thinking about that, Dr. Cottom, you've already said a few things about, very important things about institutional change, and Dr. Shedd, you also have institutional change versus individual change. I'm wondering if you could tell our audience or give our audience some specific examples about the kinds of structural institutional changes that they might as citizens start supporting and working towards, since this is a theory about a series about change.
Yeah.
Give us something to hold on to that we can unite behind, even if it's just a slogan. What's the stick that we can be wielding here?
The general population, I think, because I feel this way often about K through 12 schools, by the way, as a person who does not have children in school, I'm always like, okay, how do I help schools? But I'm not a parent and I can't be a weirdo at the playground. So what do you know, how do I, as like a citizen and a person who cares and who understands that, you know, like we're collectively invested, what are we supposed to do? And higher education, actually doesn't even have that starting point. I think we at least have the idea that we all somehow generally benefit from K through 12 schools. Public higher education, however, has been so restricted to the idea of individual welfare, right? Mm-hmm. You go to school so you have a good life, right? You choose the right major so you can get the good job with the good income. We don't even have a starting point of the idea that college belongs to all of us as a social institution, as part of public life, that it is part of the social fabric. We don't even have that. So I always think that I'm a huge proponent of discourse shaping our imaginations about things. And I think everybody can participate in a better discourse at whatever level they're in, whether that's just in their personal lives, whether that's in their civic life, in the workplace, you know, when they participate in media, whatever it is. But developing, I think we could co-develop as citizens a language about talking about higher education that replace these metaphors of mobility that are based on individualism with new, better metaphors of collectivism. Mm-hmm. Like that's just a really low-hanging fruit to me. That doesn't cost money. It's pretty much low. It's, you know, very low risk, but it is saying that instead of saying work hard so you can get a good job, maybe we can write a different narrative about what college is, right? Maybe, you know, you work hard whether you're in college or not, but isn't it great that college is there for a place for us to take classes on the weekend or to go to the museum, right? To think of them as those kinds of spaces. That's like on the, to my mind, like the public side. On the flip side, institutions themselves would have to understand themselves as places where the public has a vested interest And many of us do not. You only have to look at the physical tensions between town and gown. These acrimonious town and gown relations are a physical manifestation of the ways we have divided our social sphere. The college is in here, society is out there, right? As students became more diverse, that they challenged that idea just by our bodies being there. I say as a person who came in one of those bodies, right? Just being a Black woman in college, I challenged that perception. We can't leave the parts of our racial gendered selves outside of the walls of college. And so I know that there are people within the institution who certainly know that, but as you pointed out, they have a lot of structural barriers to becoming the people who shape the narrative of the institution, who shape the imagination of institutions. And so I think you need both you need an audience and you need, people on the other side who understand that there is an audience, that college is more than the people who are within the building. I don't think accessible, affordable public higher education survives another generation or two without that narrative.
Wow, that's great. Dr. Shedd, what about you?
Yeah, I think that's powerful, particularly to put it in the context of the City University of New York and thinking about the various paths that people take to engage in higher education in just this city. And I can go from my understanding about the trajectories that young people might have in entering their school buildings in New York City, prior to COVID, where they'd have to confront an NYPD school police force, bigger than most state and most city police forces. So the NYPD school police is bigger in number than the Boston Police Department itself. To then think of who are they, do they belong in this space? What are the technologies and the different surveillance apparatus that they may have to navigate through in order to access the education, and to think about education not just as a process or something they're engaging in, but also as an outcome. And so for me to understand the various ways that young people deal with this, and to have done GED graduation ceremonies and correctional institutions and hear people talk about getting an education in a correctional institution that they didn't get in a public school. I mean, you just think about the loss of potential and the resources that could have been better spent on the front end. So what I want to see is more investments put into the pro-social institutions, which should be our schools. And if our schools are not behaving in that manner, last summer I sat on a panel between Miriam Kaba and David Stovall, and they both were like on school abolition and abolish the school. And I was like, wait a minute, stop, like sounding very alarmist. And, we came to the agreement and conclusion that what they were talking about, those are not schools. Those are merely institutions that are controlling and surveilling and holding people instead of educating them. So really, to make it clear that what our missions are in the realm of education, and to make sure the practices and policies in schools are in alignment with that, will do so much, I think, to change those trajectories of an educational continuum. And so that's what I really want the focus to be. And even for this sort of, tension between what an institution is, there are ways that we do that in our public universities, where there's this idea of an outsider and who does belong in that space, and how people respond to that. They're wearing IDs, they have CUNY apparel down to, everything. And it shouldn't be that way. It should be assumed that this community is open because it is public. And so it really should transform our idea of what public means as well, belonging to people. And that's why I'm so interested in public institutions like schools, and then to think about it in the realm of the justice system when something has gone wrong, and we can't put the corrective infrastructures on the back end when things have gone wrong. And I see that all too often, and that's what I want to disrupt. Thank you
both. I want the audience to know around 8:15 we'll start looking at your questions. So if you have a question, I'll put it in the Q&A. I've got one more question for our distinguished panelists, and then we'll start asking and going through your questions. Dr. Cottom and Dr. Shedd, June Jordan, the great activist and writer, asks the questions, how can the American university teach otherwise? So let's end with just a June Jordan wide open question. How can the American university teach otherwise? Dr. Shedd, why don't you start this time?
Yeah. I will say one perhaps deficit to this conversation is not foregrounding the voices and the ideas of young people. Here we are as, education experts on this panel, and we bring knowledge to this space, but to think, about the individuals who are a marginalized group of young people who confront these policies and practices every day, and they have so much to say about policy efficacy and about what's working or not working, and they are truly the experiment, the guinea pigs in these policy experiments that we're running right now. Even thinking about, kids can go back in, they're fine, they don't transmit the virus, and we're still waiting on the science to catch up to these pronouncements. And so what I'm thinking about is that we truly keep track of young people and their experiences and their perceptions of encountering all of these, manifest forms of policy that impact them, but they're often not heard and they're often not taken seriously in terms of their voices counting.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I would absolutely second that. I think about how many of the decisions are made in a complex institutional organism like today's higher education system. And we talk a lot about the declining power of faculty voice. The student voice is absolutely gone. Now people say, no, but students are all that matter. We do everything for students. No, we do anything for our customers, right? We have restricted student voice and contribution to the institution to the very narrowest pinpoint of only their tuition dollars. They get to speak by their feet, as the saying goes. They either come or they go. That's actually not a participatory system. That is a form of exchange. And if we have not learned anything else from this public health crisis, that is also an economic crisis, that's also a faith crisis, is that the consumer model narrowing our participation in institutions to merely a consumer works when everything is fine. But then you can't get people's buy-in when things aren't fine. You can't get people to do collective sacrifice when you've treated them like a customer for 20 years, right? You can't get people to give you a little grace when your online teaching tools aren't quite ready to go. You can't get families to say, listen, we believe in this institution and we just know the school year is going to be rough, right? And we're all kind of in this together. One of the reasons why so many institutions struggled to get that sort of buy-in when they so desperately needed it and the grace is because they hadn't given any grace to their students in a very long time. And in fact, hadn't treated them like students in a very long time. And so if we were going to change anything, I think the faculty voice is only as powerful as it can be when it is a conduit for helping to shape a stage for the student voice. And we've sort of narrowed even our faculty voice to the idea of thinking it's just about us as the professoriate. And I always understood things like tenure protections as being about giving us the freedom to stand in the gap for students and to create space for students. And I think we have to revisit those concepts and center the student experience and student learning in institutions that have quite frankly become, fundraising vehicles, investment vehicles, and political operatives, and have diminished learning to a degree that people don't even expect there to be a student in the space.
Thank you. I think you both know that this is music to my heart because the Futures Initiative is totally based on student-centered, active learning, radical pedagogy, where constantly our programs are put on by students. We let students make we invite students to teach us a lot about what things need to change at the institution, both in the classrooms and on a structural level. It's not even easy to turn the ship around. It's not easy to Find other faculty, some faculty, for example, resist the idea that students have something not just as customers, as you say, but actually as people who are producing knowledge and actually can do a darn good job of producing knowledge creatively, imaginatively, politically, and in engaged ways. And they are citizens out there in this world too, and they can bring that into the classroom in a very powerful way if we let them. And some of that is even individual in the sense that and I see our first question here. I hope it's a student that's asking this. So instead of me talking, I'll ask the first question we have for you. Thank you both. And we'll now go to questions and answers from the audience. I've learned so much, and I knew I would. And we have more to learn now as we ask these questions. This is from, I won't say the name because I don't know if I have permission to use the name or not, but the question is, how do we need to change pedagogy to achieve equality?
What do you think, Dr. Shedd?
That's like more of Cathy's question to answer.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that is what the Futures Initiative has been about. Okay, so I think as somebody who actually does think about pedagogy a lot, and certainly more than I'm actually usually expected to, and I think people are always surprised that I care about pedagogy, is that there isn't a pedagogy. You know, there's a pedagogical philosophy, and you have to have a certain amount of flexibility. And I think we would benefit a lot from drawing as much from creative processes as we do from like scientific learning. There was just this hard push towards scientific learning in the mid-20th century. Not that I have to tell Cathy, she has a whole book about this, but it left behind the idea of what human-centric sort of learning was about. And I would point out, I would draw a very direct line from that sort of scientific teaching approach to ideas about racial superiority and inferiority, by the way. So whose learning positions and knowledges you respect are absolutely tied to this doubling down on scientific learning as an excuse, as a justification for not including those forms of knowledge in our pedagogical practices. So I always say this: one professor in one classroom can't be every pedagogical principle. That this is why collective teaching and collective pedagogical conversations, I think, work best. Every student and every teacher is not the teacher for every student, and vice versa. And there are different approaches, and that's why we don't do a one-room schoolroom. There's supposed to be the sort of dynamic ecosystem of pedagogical practices. But first, everybody's got to agree that pedagogy matters and that they're going to participate in that collective conversation. I think pedagogy matters, not just for the sake of it, but I think it matters to inequality.
But I think with, the COVID-19 crisis, we're moving to one-room schoolhouses, whether it's, remotely learning from home to then thinking of the pods that are happening, even in the schools that are reopening where kids can't move about. And there is a bit of constraint in the types of learning strategies that can be implemented. So this really is a moment where we will see great variation in the strategies that are used and the receptiveness to those strategies. And it's true, this is where that individualist piece comes in, that we can't use a one-size-fits-all strategy for learners as well as for teachers. And we are really struggling with that tension right now. And I think it will persist as we go through this crisis.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. If I can just add one quick thing, we do know that active participatory learning, where students actually have agency in how they learn, is superior in all fields. A very, very large study of 250 other studies comparing traditional learning to active learning. The punchline of the study, this came out in the publications of the National Academy of Sciences about 4 years ago. The punchline was, if this had been a drug, traditional education would have been taken off the market. There's so much difference in every way: motivation, creativity, staying in school, inspiring others, contributing to community, and even that thing we don't want to say, social mobility. All of those are enhanced by real active agency given to students and students taking that. We have another question about community colleges. What do you see as the role and importance of community colleges? Maybe Dr. Shedd, why don't you start this one first?
I mean, I think for many young people, as we survey them about what their, occupational dreams are, and this is from, my research in Chicago, where you had high school students thinking about what jobs they wanted and the types of schools they wanted to go to, and really not seeing community college show up in these aspirations, even though it's a very common step to higher education and into those worlds, and seeing the possibilities of community colleges as really picking up the work that should have been done earlier on in public schooling and addressing so many gaps. But then what does it do as people move on? And I think CUNY is a really interesting experience for young people who kind of come through a public school continuum and end up at the graduate center after going through community college and then the higher ed schools, and then thinking about the idea that they have to give such great credit to the learning that happened in the community college, and we ignore it as we think about aspirations of learning and as we think about higher ed, but it's such an important piece of this continuum.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah. I would say that in this moment in particular, a story that doesn't get nearly enough legs is how well community colleges did in responding to COVID. And I think that is, I think that's due to a couple of reasons. One is because community colleges, by and large, certainly there's a lot of diversity within that sector, but by and large, community colleges absolutely do understand themselves as collectives. Absolutely. They just, because they function as them, they have so many stakeholders in a sort of day-to-day interaction. We have a lot of stakeholders too, but no, they have to actually see their various stakeholders, right? They see the people taking the hands-on automotive courses. They see the community, small entrepreneurs and business people who are coming back for a certificate. They see their community in a very different kind of way. And even the community colleges that have walls are open to their spaces and their geographies in a way that a lot of traditional four-year colleges are not. And I think because of that, they had a much better humanistic response to COVID than the rest of higher education. They were able to make decisions, and it's not because they were well endowed. And it wasn't so, this was, we can't put all of this on money. This was about, this is who we are, and this is who we are responsible to. And so you see something like the community college system in California said, no, they want one of the first to get out ahead and go, no, we're all online because it's the best thing for our students and our staffers, period. You saw it in community college systems throughout the Midwest, for example, who just made really great decisions. So I think community colleges, first of all, are a wonderful model for what collective higher education and conversations and communities look like. I think they do a better job even of talking about their students than we do. They give them more agency in the relationship than we tend to give them the rest of higher education. And I think we see that pay off. And of course, as always, they deserve far more funding and respect from the rest of higher education and from social policy.
The president emerita of LaGuardia Community College, Gail Mello, likes to talk about the top 100%. She says, it's easy to be president of Harvard, where you're dealing with the 3% selectivity rate, when your job is every day to say, who am I missing? Our job is to deal with the top 100%, to have education for everyone. Then you're constantly thinking about who am I leaving out and how can I reach them? And of course, that's exactly what you say. You're then reaching deep into the community and having the community reach back and say, we need this from you. And then as a community college, it's your job to say, this is what we can do. This is how we can try to meet that need. We have many questions about funding, and I believe it's the case that all but 2 states, New York and California, have not yet returned to the funding levels for higher education since the 2008 collapse. Other things have gone back to the level of 2008, higher education has not. And California was just very recently, and New York is kind of arguable about whether we're back to 2008 funding. Questions about how do we fight for that? How do we get our legislators to say we should be investing in higher education? It's a cultural investment. You've touched on that, but maybe specifically on funding. Maybe Dr. Cottom, do you want to start with that question?
Funding the problem with funding is that it's a political issue. And so it is not, in my experience of talking to legislators, it is not that they don't know. It is that a politician's job is to make the decision that is before them immediately that helps them keep their job. And I'm not saying that I don't want to be like dismissive about that. I mean, everybody tries to keep their job. But I'm saying that there are a set of incentives among elected officials that undercuts their ability, even if they are willing, their ability to do the long-term strategic planning and funding that higher education requires at the state level. And what they, as many senators have told me, is that I don't get angry phone calls from people mad that we didn't fund the humanities center at the local college. And they're right. Nobody that's just not, it's not a political organizing principle. We're about to go through however many more presidential and vice presidential debates in the next 35, 40 days or whatever before the election. And I don't think anybody has talked about higher education once.
Not once. Well, except for the 1776.
Yeah.
That we're going to read.
That is true. And that's talking about education, but maybe in a slightly different context. But it does not animate, and it is actually quite bizarre considering how many people now touch some system of post-secondary learning, that it's just not part of our political imagination. I attribute that to the fact that for a very long time, the funding was just so stable that we didn't have to come up with a language. And then we needed a language suddenly, and it was almost kind of too late. But there are a couple of places like, Milwaukee, admittedly they're, in a state that is very hostile to it. But organizers have done a really good job of developing a political language among voters and likely voters and activists to talk about higher education on the Hill. When they have these public lobbying days, most colleges and universities go and defend their institution, right? So the president of a college goes and makes a case for their college on lobbying day. Nobody's lobbying for higher education overall. Yeah. Right? Nobody shows up to lobby for the idea of higher education or for higher education funding, and that's a problem. I'm not sure who should do that. I have said this though I know almost 10 years now, where I go, who's manning the ship here for higher education as a system? And no one is. I don't know if it's the ACLU. I'm not sure who's supposed to do this, but someone should probably be up there making that political case. And right now, no one is doing it. And until that happens, the political problem will remain a funding problem, because nobody cares that you take money from higher education to balance the budget.
One intervention has been the sort of political movement around defunding policing and police-free schools. And I think from the early 2000s, with the rise of mass incarceration, in that moment where people were okay with understanding the changes in budgets from education then going into criminal justice. And so we can mark those trajectories of funding toward correctional institutions or more policing and seeing deficits come to educational funding. And now to sort of see the resurgence and activism around looking at the money and saying we could fund, schools in a way that we don't have to do it under the lens of policing. And we're not making police officers be mentors. How about we actually get mentors and counselors and psychologists and social workers instead of making police perform these roles? So I'm thinking about the long-running work of places like the Advancement Project and other sorts of nonprofit institutions that have been doing the work of saying, look at what we're spending our money on and to what effect. How is this helping us? And so seeing these police-free movements, whether it's in Minnesota or thinking about even the fights around CUNY and funding around NYPD and what that means for educational funding, I think it's so important for us to focus on those fights now.
In some states, it's almost flipped, hasn't it? The amount of money going to higher education, the amount of money going to the carceral system has flipped in the last 20 years. Yeah. We have one very heartfelt question that seems like a lovely place to end. It's an individual question, and they want your advice, the advice you might have. What advice do you have for graduate students of color who often feel discouraged by their institutions, which are often white and male dominated? Help. What lifeline do you have for the student who asked that question?
Mm-hmm.
I bet there's a lot of students asking that question.
Yeah.
Dr. Shedd, you go first.
Okay. You know, it's a hard one because we can think about the sorts of impact that as, you know, a Black woman standing in front of a classroom or sitting at the, you know, dominant end of the seminar table, I know it makes a difference in how students sort of can view themselves by virtue of viewing me. And I've worked at a few different types of institutions and really noticed the impact of just my physical presence, but also dealing with the kind of burden of taking on the role of being, you know, a mentor to the students, and then also having a marginal position when I was a junior professor in another place where, you know, my senior colleagues were these same white men that I was seeing, you know, as a colleague, but not really. So the blessing and the curse of your presence in the space is disruptive in a good way, but it's also disruptive in a bad way, you know, and thinking about how to sort of expand the population and the reach of professors of color, and particularly, you know, Black women in this moment, I think is so important. And I want to make the students know that, you know, we're a resource, but we're also burdened and struggling. And so you have to really expand your team and reach out to other people to supplement what it is that we can do. But we have to increase our numbers and we have to help you proceed through. And that's what we're trying to do. So it's a sort of individual effort that becomes collective if there are allies who will step in and jump in that don't have to be, you know, the exact Black women, but they know and disrupt the behaviors that are destructive to the most marginal students.
Thank you very much. I think Dr. Cottom, that's the last word of the evening. Do you want to have some advice for this student?
I would echo all of that, and with emphasis on the part that it actually can't just be Black women who do this work in the academy, because there just simply aren't enough of us to do it in every space where we're needed. So people are going to have to train themselves, meaning don't come to us for training. Train yourselves to come in and help. You know, there's YouTube, figure it out, and then jump on in. And and to the student, I'm going to tell you, I'm always so scared to give advice, because advice, I need to know so much about you. Like, you know, how many cousins do you have? Where you're from? What's your student loan debt look like? Like, I just need to know so much, and it's so hard to give generalized advice. I always panic on this question. So I punt by telling you what mattered to me as a graduate student of color. One thing that mattered was something that my mentor told me very early in the process. I will never forget it. He said, your job is not to change that institution. Your job is to not let that institution change you. I think that a lot of the rules and norms that we have for traditional, you know, majority culture graduate students simply don't fit graduate students of color. I think that you make the most efficient, life-affirming path through graduate school that you can make. I think that the longer you are there in a position of limited power, the more you expose yourself to abuse and oppression and harm. And that is under the best of circumstances, truly. So I think that you go in mapping out that you are going to protect yourself in your mental health and your physical health and your well-being. And for me, that looks like positioning myself as, you know, my job in graduate school, as I understood it, was to extract as much from the institution as it was going to try to extract from me. So you get in, you get as much out of that institution as you possibly can, with the understanding that if you do that and you're still whole on the other side, you can accrue enough institutional power to enter in an institution where you can transform it in limited ways, but where you can do it. And then, you know, all of the other usual caveats, I think, which is, you know, people will encourage you to forget where you came from, because so much of graduate school professionalization is remaking your sense of self and your identity, but who you came from and your identity is actually what's going to keep you sane and alive. So don't let them. go home as much as you can. As long as breaking you as long as it doesn't break you to do so, go home as much as you can. Treat this as an exchange rather than a relationship where you're coming to get something from them that you need for your identity. You can never get that from graduate school. And be well and get sleep.
Yes. That is the perfect way to end. I knew this was going to be a great conversation. You two are amazing. I learn from you every day. On Twitter from both of you and everywhere else. Thank you so much for being here as part of this program. Thank you to Public Programs for creating this venue. It's just been a real pleasure, and more than a pleasure. It's been an incredibly meaningful evening in a grim time. Thank you so much. Thank you both.
Thank you. And thank you, Carla. So good to see you. And thank you, Cathy, for being actually a wonderful partner to many of us along this journey in higher education. So thanks for that.
Thank you.
Back at both of you. Take care. Good night, everybody. Good night to our audience. Thank you all for being here tonight. And be well and get sleep.
Get sleep.